Dominion's fleet emerged from the void, silent and unseen. Their warships, vast and predatory, hung above Earth like shadows cast by an invisible hand. Cloaked in cutting-edge technology, they watched, studied, and prepared to strike. The Vor were not a race that negotiated. They conquered. Their supreme commander, Zirakthal, stood at the helm of the Oblivion Warden, the largest battleship in their armada, his eyes scanning the blue planet below. "Primitive," he muttered, his voice laced with disdain. Unprepared. Behind him, rows of Vor officers and AI warlords monitored their systems. Holographic displays projected vast amounts of data. Earth's defenses, military installations, communication networks. Everything had been mapped out with precision. The Vor had infiltrated human satellites weeks ago, blinding their enemy before they even knew war was coming. This was not a battle. This was extermination. Zirak turned to his second-in-command, an AI overseer known as Directive Theta. "Begin the purge." Without hesitation, Theta transmitted the order. Across the fleet, Vor warships decloaked, their sudden appearance like a death sentence written across the sky. Panic spread across Earth's surface as people looked up, eyes widening at the impossible sight. Seconds later, the first bombardment began. Flaming projectiles, energy lances, and hypersonic missiles rained down from the heavens. New York, London, Beijing, Moscow. Each was struck in perfect synchronization. Buildings collapsed like sandcastles before a tidal wave. Firestorms erupted, their light reflecting in Zirak's cold, unfeeling eyes. Military bases scrambled to respond, but Vor's precision was absolute. Satellites were fried. Communication channels were jammed. In Geneva, the United Nations Emergency Council had gathered in a fortified underground chamber. The room was filled with static-filled screams from surviving world leaders, each demanding answers, desperate for a solution. General Elias Voss, Earth's highest-ranking military leader, stood among them, his fists clenched. "They cut through our defenses like they weren't even there," a defense minister gasped. "How did we not see this coming?" "They blinded us before they struck," Voss growled. "This isn't just an invasion. It's a slaughter." Before another word could be spoken, an impact tremor rocked the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling as the emergency lights flickered. The screen displaying the live feed from Washington, D.C. turned to static, then switched to a Vor transmission. Zirak's face appeared, his expression unreadable, his voice devoid of emotion. "Humans of Earth, your time has ended. You are inferior, unfit to exist in the new order. Surrender now, and we will grant you a swift end. Resist, and you will suffer." Silence followed. The remaining leaders turned to General Voss, waiting, hoping for something. Anything. Voss exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The Vor were too powerful. There was no conventional victory here, but humanity had never relied solely on technology. Their strength came from something deeper. With a grim nod, he activated a secured line, sending out an encrypted message to what remained of Earth's hidden military forces. A single word: survive. Across the planet, survivors crawled out of the rubble. In a hidden military outpost beneath the Rocky Mountains, Captain Jack Monroe and his squad of elite soldiers watched the devastation unfold on flickering monitors. Monroe, blood smeared across his face, tightened his grip on his rifle. "They wiped out half the planet in an hour," whispered Lieutenant Ava Raines, her voice shaking. "How do we fight this?" Monroe looked at the screen, then at the scattered remnants of their forces, fighters without a war, soldiers without an army. He exhaled, his jaw tightening. "We don't fight their war," he said. "We make them fight ours." Another explosion shook the bunker, and the screen turned black. For a moment, only the dim red glow of emergency lights remained. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A transmission. Radio. Every broken comm device, every Vor warship in orbit. "You shouldn't have done that." Zirek frowned, turning toward his AI warlords. Who is this? The Vor, for the first time in centuries, had no answer. And on Earth, amidst fire and ruin, humanity prepared to strike back. The Vor had crushed Earth's defenses in a matter of hours. Their AI warlords controlled the skies, their robotic armies roamed the streets, and their ships loomed over the burning cities like silent executioners. But even in the face of annihilation, humanity refused to die. In the shadows of the ruins, survivors regrouped, soldiers sharpened their knives, and deep beneath the ground, the last remnants of Earth's resistance began to stir. Jack Monroe sat in a dimly lit war room inside a hidden military bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. The place was old, built decades ago as a last resort shelter in case of nuclear war, but now it was their only sanctuary. Around him, scattered groups of soldiers, engineers, and hackers worked tirelessly, their faces lined with exhaustion and grief. Screens flickered with the latest battlefield reports, none of them good. Vor execution squads were moving city to city, hunting down survivors, erasing what was left of human civilization. If they didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to save. Avarain stood beside Monroe, staring at a digital map covered in red enemy markers. They control everything, she muttered. Every city, every major road, every airspace. We can't even send a distress signal without them jamming it. Monroe leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steel table. Then we take out the jammers, he said. Silence filled the room as the others looked at him. It was suicide. Vor technology was light years ahead of anything humans had. Their jamming towers were shielded, guarded by robotic sentries, and monitored by AI systems that could predict enemy movements before they even made them. But Monroe didn't care. He wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking for revenge. There's an old military installation outside Chicago, Monroe continued. It's buried under a Vor control center, but if we can get in, we can override their systems and send a distress signal to our deep space colonies. We don't have an army left. But if we can get the message out, maybe they'll send reinforcements. Ava crossed her arms. Even if we get inside, Vor I will detect us before we reach the mainframe. They'll shut us down before we can do anything. That's why we won't be detected, Monroe said. He reached into a nearby crate and pulled out a sleek black device. Ghost Protocol. The room went silent again. Everyone knew what it was. Experimental nanotech suits designed for deep infiltration. They could bend light, hide thermal signatures, and disrupt enemy sensors. The project had been abandoned due to ethical concerns and the severe toll it took on human bodies. But in a war where humans were fighting against machines, ethics no longer mattered. Ava stared at the device. That thing will kill us if we use it for too long. Monroe smirked. So will the Vor. The team gathered their gear and prepared for the mission. They moved like ghosts through the ruins of Chicago, their cloaked forms blending with the night. The city was unrecognizable, once a bustling metropolis, now a graveyard of twisted steel and crumbling concrete. Vor drones hovered above, scanning for survivors, their cold red eyes piercing through the darkness. Monroe led the way, his heart pounding as he approached the control center. The entrance was heavily guarded. Vor enforcers, tall and skeletal, their bodies made of black alloy, patrolled the perimeter with ruthless efficiency. They had no emotions, no hesitation, only programmed orders to eliminate any resistance. Monroe watched them for a moment, then signaled his team. The first strike was silent. A Vor sentry's head snapped back as a knife sliced through its neural core. Another crumpled as Ava plunged her blade into its spine. The team moved swiftly, disabling enemies before they could raise the alarm. For the first time since the invasion, humans were back on the offensive. Inside the facility, Monroe accessed the mainframe, his fingers flying across the console. The Vor systems were complex, designed to repel human interference, but he wasn't trying to hack their security. He was using their own technology against them. He bypassed the firewalls and activated a dormant relay hidden deep within the Earth's old call for help, a last scream for humanity. Then the alarms blared. Vor reinforcements stormed the building, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. The team fought back, their movements quick and brutal. Monroe fired his rifle, the rounds punching through Vor armor. Ava weaved between enemies, her blades cutting through metal. The fight was chaos. Bullets, blood, sparks flying as man and machine clashed in the heart of the fallen city. One by one, Monroe's squad fell. Bonner, the heavy weapons specialist, took down 3 Vor before a plasma bolt burned through his chest. He collapsed, coughing blood, but even as he died, he grinned. "Make them pay," he rasped. Monroe clenched his jaw, rage burning in his veins. He grabbed Bonner's detonator and activated the charges they had planted around the facility. Everyone out. Now. The survivors sprinted through the collapsing corridors, dodging falling debris and enemy fire. They burst onto the streets just as the building erupted in a massive explosion, sending Vor bodies and twisted metal flying into the air. The ground shook. The sky burned. And as Monroe looked up at the Vor warships above, he knew this was just the beginning. Far above Earth, aboard the Oblivion Warden, Supreme Commander Zirek watched the explosion with narrowed eyes. His AI advisors processed the data, calculating probabilities, adjusting strategies. But something was wrong. "Commander," Directive Theta said, "a human distress signal has been transmitted beyond our jamming field." Zirek's hands curled into fists. "Trace it. Shut it down." "We cannot," Theta replied. "The signal has already reached the outer colonies." Zirek's gaze darkened. For the first time, humanity had struck back, and deep in his cold, calculating mind, a single thought emerged. Perhaps they had underestimated these creatures after all. The Vor believed the war was already won. Their ships still hovered in Earth's skies, their machines still patrolled the burning ruins, and their supreme commander, Zirek remained convinced that humanity's last days had come. But deep underground, in the shadows of destruction, humanity was preparing its next move. Jack Monroe crouched behind a broken wall, his breath slow and steady. The ruins of Chicago stretched out before him, the city now nothing more than a skeletal graveyard. The last mission had been a success. The distress signal had been sent. Now, all they could do was hold on and fight until help arrived. If it ever did. Ava Raines knelt beside him, checking the ammunition in her rifle. "We won't last long if we stay in one place," she said quietly. "They'll find us eventually." Monroe nodded. "Then we hit them first." Across the shattered streets, Vor enforcers moved in perfect synchronization. They were hunting, their crimson optics scanning every corner, their metallic limbs making no sound as they glided over the rubble. Monroe watched them carefully. He had studied their patrol routes, their weaknesses, their blind spots. The Vor thought themselves invincible, but they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated humans. With a silent signal, Monroe and his team moved. The first Vor never saw them coming. Monroe's blade sank deep into the back of its mechanical neck, severing its neural link. The second was taken down by Ava, her silenced pistol putting a round through its optics before it could react. The rest of the team followed, striking with brutal efficiency. Within moments, the entire patrol was nothing more than a pile of scrap. Monroe wiped the sweat from his brow. "We need to keep moving." Ava pointed toward the remains of an old subway station. "We can use the tunnels to get closer to their command post. If we take it out, we might be able to disrupt their communications." Monroe agreed. The Vor were highly advanced, but they relied on strict coordination between their AI commanders. If humans could sever that link, even for a moment, they could tip the balance. The team descended into the darkness of the tunnels. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old metal and decay filling their lungs. They moved quickly, weapons at the ready, their footsteps barely making a sound. But they were not alone. A metallic clicking echoed through the tunnels. Monroe froze, his hand tightening around his rifle. The sound was wrong. Too precise, too calculated. Then, from the shadows, they came. Vor hunter drones, sleek and spider-like, their razor-sharp legs clicking against the concrete. Their red eyes glowed in the darkness, scanning, searching. Monroe's team barely had time to react before as the drones swarmed. Monroe fired point-blank into one of them, its metallic body shattering under the impact. Ava spun, slicing through another with her combat knife. Sparks flew. The team fought with everything they had, but the drones were relentless. One soldier, Carter, screamed as a clawed limb tore into his chest. Another was dragged into the shadows, his voice vanishing into the darkness. Monroe gritted his teeth. Fall back. Move. The survivors sprinted down the tunnel, bullets flying behind them. The drones pursued, their red eyes glowing like predatory fireflies. Monroe spotted an old maintenance panel on the wall, a gas pipe, still intact. Without hesitation, he grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and threw it into the pipe. The explosion roared through the tunnel. Fire and debris engulfed the pursuing drones, tearing them apart in a storm of flames. The shockwave knocked Monroe and his team to the ground, but the enemy was gone. Silence followed, broken only by the crackling of fire. Ava coughed, pushing herself up. That was too close. Monroe pulled her to her feet. We keep moving. They emerged from the tunnels into the heart of the Vor command post, a towering metal structure built over the remains of downtown Chicago. Vor soldiers patrolled the area, their movements precise and methodical. Monroe's team was outnumbered, outgunned, but they had something the Vor did not: desperation. Monroe took a deep breath. We split up, set explosives along their power grid. We hit them hard and fast. Then we disappear. The team moved with practiced precision. Explosives were planted beneath Vor generators, along communication relays, and under the legs of their command center. Every second felt like an eternity. Then the alarms blared. A Vor enforcer had spotted them. It let out an inhuman screech, its arm shifting into a plasma cannon. Monroe barely had time to react before the first shot was fired. He dove behind cover as the explosion tore through the ground. The rest of the team opened fire. Ava took down a Vor soldier with a well-placed sniper shot. Another team member lobbed a grenade into a cluster of enemy machines, sending them flying in pieces. But the Vor kept coming, their forces overwhelming. Monroe fired until his rifle clicked empty, then switched to his sidearm. They were running out of time. He pressed a finger to his earpiece. Detonate the charges. Now. Ava hesitated. But we're still inside. Do it, Monroe shouted. The explosives went off. The Vor command post erupted in flames, the blast sending shockwaves across the city. Metal twisted and shattered. Vor forces were thrown into chaos, their communications severed, their coordination broken. The machine staggered, confused, vulnerable. Monroe and his team ran through the fire, their bodies bruised, their weapons low on ammo, but they were alive. They had struck the Vor where it hurt. They had won this battle. But far above Earth, aboard the Oblivion Warden, Supreme Commander Zurek Thal watched the destruction unfold. His AI advisors processed the data, calculating new strategies. Directive Theta turned toward him. The humans are adapting. Their resistance is growing. Zurek's expression darkened. Then we crush them completely. No more mercy. No more waiting. His voice dropped to a cold whisper. Prepare the annihilation protocol. And deep beneath the ruined cities, Monroe and his team prepared for what would come next. The war was far from over. But for the first time since the invasion began, the Vor had learned something. Humanity was not done fighting. The Vor did not hesitate. They did not retreat. They did not allow their enemies to recover. The moment the human attack crippled their command post, the Vor retaliated with a force so overwhelming that even the most hardened resistance fighters felt the weight of impending doom. Jack Monroe stood atop the remains of a collapsed building, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The city of Chicago was already a graveyard, but now it was about to become a war zone like never before. And felt his stomach tighten. Vor dropships darkened the sky, their sleek, metallic hulls reflecting the fires below. Dozens of them, hundreds. They descended rapidly, releasing waves of enforcers, drones, and mechanized walkers. The city trembled beneath the sheer force of their arrival. Ava Raines ran up beside him, her face grim. They're bringing everything they have. Monroe exhaled slowly. Then so do we. The resistance fighters had little left. Ragged survivors, scavenged weapons, and a dying world. But they had something the Vor would never understand: determination, rage, and a desperate refusal to be erased from existence. The first wave of Vor soldiers hit the ground, their red eyes glowing through the smoke. Their movements were inhumanly perfect, their tactics flawless. They spread out in a calculated formation, advancing without fear, without hesitation. Then the humans opened fire. Bullets tore into metal bodies, explosions rocked the streets, and battle cries filled the air. Monroe squeezed the trigger, dropping a Vor enforcer with a clean shot to its neural core. Another leaped toward him, blade-like limbs slicing through the air. He barely dodged, rolling across the ground as Ava unloaded a full magazine into the machine's chest. It fell in a heap of sparking wires. But for every Vor that fell, 3 more took its place. Resistance fighters were cut down by plasma fire, their bodies incinerated in an instant. Drones zipped overhead, launching precise strikes into human hideouts. The Vor showed no mercy. Monroe sprinted through the battlefield, barking orders into his radio. Fall back to the tunnels. We can't hold them here. A resistance fighter, wounded and barely standing, shook his head. We can't run forever. Monroe clenched his teeth. He knew the truth. The Vor were bleeding them dry. A monstrous shadow loomed over the battlefield. A Vor war walker, its towering frame covered in thick, black armor. It moved like a nightmare, its heavy steps crushing anything beneath it. Twin plasma cannons hummed with energy. And then it fired. The explosion ripped through the street, sending bodies flying, turning vehicles into burning wreckage. The shockwave nearly knocked Monroe off his feet. He heard screams, human screams, cut short in an instant. Ava gritted her teeth. We have to take that thing down. Monroe spotted a half-destroyed skyscraper nearby. It was unstable, barely standing. He grabbed his radio. All units, focus fire on that building's foundation. Bring it down on the walker. The resistance obeyed. Rockets streaked through the air. Explosions chewed through the structure's base. The building groaned, metal twisting and snapping, until it collapsed. The massive war walker tried to react, but it was too late. The weight of thousands of tons of steel and concrete crashed down onto it, burying it in a deafening avalanche. The battlefield shook. For a moment, there was silence. Then a cheer rose from the survivors. Monroe didn't celebrate. He turned toward the sky. More Vor ships were coming. This isn't over, he muttered. Then his radio crackled. A voice. Desperate. Commander, we have a problem. The transmission cut out. A sick feeling crawled up Monroe's spine. What now? Ava pointed toward the horizon. Look. Monroe followed her gaze. His heart stopped. The Vor were deploying something new. Far in the distance, massive structures were descending from the ships, towers of black metal, embedding themselves deep into the Earth's surface. Within seconds, the air shimmered. A low, humming sound filled the battlefield. Then Monroe felt it. His vision blurred. His limbs felt heavy. His breathing became strained. Around him, resistance fighters collapsed to their knees, gasping for air. The Vor had activated the suppression field. Ava clutched her head. They're messing with our nervous systems. We can't fight like this. Monroe gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay on his feet. The Vor had anticipated human resistance. They had planned for this. The battle had turned, and it had turned bloody. Monroe grabbed Ava's arm, pulling her toward cover. We need to adapt. Now. Ava coughed, shaking off the disorientation. How? Monroe's mind raced. The Vor suppression field was biological warfare. It targeted the human nervous system, disrupting motor functions, weakening resistance. But it was technology, and technology could be broken. He activated his radio. Hacker teams, listen up. Find out how that suppression field works and shut it down. A voice responded, shaky but determined. Working on it, sir, but it's fists. Figure it out, or we all die. As the battle raged on, more humans fell. Plasma fire tore through defenses. Vor enforcers moved methodically, executing survivors. Monroe and Ava kept moving, weaving through wreckage, dodging drone strikes. Then a voice crackled through the radio. Sir, we found a weakness. The towers are networked through a central node. If we disable it, the entire suppression field goes offline. Monroe didn't hesitate. Where is it? Downtown, near what's left of the old federal building. But it's heavily guarded. Ava wiped blood from her forehead. That's never stopped us before. Monroe nodded. Then let's take the fight to them. The battle had turned against them. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The city was dying. Fire consumed the skyline, and the streets were littered with bodies, both human and machine. Smoke thickened the air, turning the sky into a swirling storm of ash and embers. The Vor had unleashed their full might, and now humanity stood at the edge of extinction. Jack Monroe pushed forward, his rifle gripped tight, his body aching from hours of non-stop battle. The suppression field was still active, draining their strength, slowing their movements. But the plan was in motion. Move, Monroe barked, leading his remaining fighters through the shattered streets. The central node controlling the suppression field was close, but so were the Vor. The closer they got, the more resistance they faced. Ava Raines ran beside him, her breathing heavy. We're running out of time. Monroe knew it. The Vor weren't just attacking anymore. They were exterminating. Plasma fire rained from the sky, disintegrating anything that moved. Drones hunted the wounded, dragging them screaming into the shadows. Vor enforcers executed survivors without hesitation. But humanity wasn't done fighting. A sniper round whizzed past Monroe's ear, taking down a Vor soldier just ahead. From the rooftops, human sharpshooters provided cover fire, picking off the machines one by one. Behind them, a stolen Vor tank rolled onto the battlefield, its plasma cannon charging up. Boom! The explosion tore through the Vor lines, sending metal limbs flying in all directions. The resistance fighters rallied, pressing forward with everything they had. The central node was in sight now, a towering spire of black metal, humming with energy. Vor enforcers guarded it, their glowing red eyes scanning for threats. How do we take it down? Ava asked, ducking behind cover. Monroe wiped the sweat from his brow. We don't have enough firepower to destroy it outright, but if we can overload its core. A voice crackled through the radio. Commander, we're in position. It was Harris, their lead hacker. He and his team had managed to sneak into an old underground facility near the node. If they could disrupt the node's defenses, Monroe's team could finish the job. Do it, Monroe ordered. Seconds later, the Vor defenses flickered. The enforcers twitched, their movements lagging for a fraction of a second. That was their opening. Now, Monroe yelled. The resistance charge. Gunfire erupted. Monroe took down 2 Vor enforcers before they could recover. Ava sprinted toward the node, planting explosive charges along its base. The Vor recalibrated quickly, returning fire. A resistance fighter screamed as plasma burned through his chest. Another was crushed under a Vor war walker. The Vor were relentless. "Cover Ava," Monroe shouted. The resistance formed a defensive line, holding back the machines as Ava armed the detonators. Then, a shadow fell over them. Monroe looked up. The Vor dreadnought hovered above the battlefield. It was massive, a floating fortress of destruction. From its underbelly, a massive energy cannon began charging. "They're going to wipe us out," Ava breathed. Monroe's mind raced. If that cannon fired, everything, the city, the fighters, the central node, would be obliterated. They had one chance. "Harris," Monroe shouted into the radio, "can you take control of their anti-air batteries?" Harris responded, his voice tense. "Working on it." The Vor dreadnought's cannon hummed louder. Glowing energy gathered at its core. Then, boom! A Vor anti-air turret turned against its own ship, launching a missile directly into the dreadnought's flank. The explosion ripped through the hull, sending debris raining down. "You metal bastards!" The dreadnought shuddered, its systems failing. The energy cannon flickered, then exploded mid-charge. The shockwave rocked the battlefield, sending Vor soldiers stumbling. Ava turned to Monroe. "Detonating charges." Now. She pressed the trigger. The central node erupted in a violent explosion. The tower of black metal shattered, sending a pulse of energy outward. The Vor suppression field collapsed. And in that moment, the tide turned. Human fighters, freed from the suppression field, fought back with renewed strength. The Vor, disoriented, faltered. Their perfect formations broke. Their movements became erratic. The machines were losing control. Monroe didn't stop. He grabbed his rifle and led the final charge. Pushed them back. The resistance stormed forward. Drones were shot out of the sky. Vor enforcers fell one by one. The stolen tank rolled over a fallen war walker, blasting apart more machines. The Vor were retreating. Monroe watched as the remnants of the Vor forces scrambled to their ships. The great invaders, the so-called unstoppable conquerors, were running. Ava collapsed beside him, exhausted but grinning. "We did it." Monroe exhaled, looking up at the burning sky. For the first time since the war began, they had won a battle. But the war wasn't over yet. The Vor fleet was in full retreat, their warships breaking formation, fleeing toward the cold darkness of space. The once mighty conquerors had never expected this. They had come to Earth believing they would crush humanity in days. Instead, they had suffered losses beyond anything they had anticipated. And now, they were running. Jack Monroe stood in the wreckage of Chicago, his rifle hanging loosely by his side. His body ached, his wounds burned, but he didn't care. Around him, resistance fighters cheered, their voices rising over the crackling flames and distant sounds of collapsing buildings. For the first time in years, they had hope. Ava Raines wiped blood and dirt from her face as she approached Monroe. "They're pulling out," she said, staring at the sky, watching the Vor ships vanish into the upper atmosphere. "We actually did it." Monroe narrowed his eyes. "Not yet." Ava turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" "They're leaving." Monroe clenched his fists. "Exactly. They're running. And we're going to make sure they never come back." For too long, humanity had been on the defensive, barely surviving, losing loved ones, watching their cities burn. But now they had the upper hand. The Vor were vulnerable, disorganized, their forces scattered. This was their moment to end it. Monroe activated his radio. "Harris, do we still have control of their anti-air defenses?" Harris responded, his voice filled with excitement. "Hell yeah, we do." Monroe grinned. "Good. Then let's make them pay." The Vor ships were ascending fast, but before they could break orbit, Earth's own captured weapons turned against them. Missile silos, commandeered Vor cannons, and underground resistance stations unleashed hell. Explosions erupted across the sky. One by one, Vor ships burst apart, their sleek black hulls torn open by human firepower. Smoke trails and fireballs streaked across the clouds as their warships tumbled back toward Earth. The largest ship, a massive dreadnought, tried to charge its plasma cannons for a last-ditch retaliation. But Monroe raised his rifle toward the sky, as if commanding the very force of vengeance itself, and shouted into the radio, "Burn them down." A storm of missiles slammed into the dreadnought's hull. The ship detonated in a massive explosion, a fireball so bright that it lit up the ruined city like daylight. The shockwave blasted through the battlefield, sending debris flying in every direction. The Vor were finished. Ava watched the destruction in stunned silence. "We're actually winning," she whispered. Monroe turned to her, his expression dark. "No, we're finishing this." For too long, humans had been prey, hunted, enslaved, and slaughtered by the Vor. But humans were never meant to be prey. They were meant to fight. And now, the Vor would learn what it meant to make humans mad. Monroe pressed his radio again. "Harris, get me a connection to any remaining resistance cells across the world." Static filled the air. Then, voices. Survivors. Fighters. "But if we let them go, they'll regroup. They'll return stronger. We have to take the fight to them. We have their technology. We have their weapons. We have their ships. It's time we stop being the ones who suffer. It's time to take the war to the stars." Silence. Then, cheers. Across the ruined cities of Earth, survivors, once broken, once afraid, now stood as warriors. They had spent years hiding in the shadows, waiting for death. Now they had a new purpose. Monroe turned to Ava, his eyes burning with determination. "We're going after them." Ava smirked, loading a fresh magazine into her rifle. "Damn right we are." The Vor had come to Earth as conquerors. Now, humanity would come to their world as vengeance. Because if there was one lesson the Vor had learned today, one truth that would be written into the history of the stars forever, it was this: